Welcome to Pages from History. Today we uncover the epic story of the Celts, warriors who made Rome tremble, and druids who guarded ancient secrets. The Celts, warriors, druids, and the people Rome couldn't break. This should have been impossible. A scattered collection of tribes without a unified empire, without written military manuals, without the discipline of Roman legions, yet they brought the eternal city to its knees. What made these warriors so terrifying that Roman mothers used their name to frighten children? What secrets did their druids guard in sacred groves? And why, after centuries of Roman conquest, did the Celtic spirit refuse to die? Stay with us until the end, because this story will change everything you thought you knew about ancient Europe. First, origins of power. How Celtic tribes conquered ancient Europe. Long before Rome became an empire, long before Julius Caesar marched his legions across the Rhine, Europe belonged to a people whose name still echoes through history. The Celts. They were not one nation, but hundreds of tribes united by language, culture, and a warrior spirit that would define an entire age. From the Atlantic coasts of Ireland to the mountains of Anatolia, from the frozen north of Scotland to the sun-baked hills of Spain, Celtic voices rang out in markets, battlefields, and sacred groves. This was their world, and for nearly 1,000 years, they shaped it with iron swords and golden art. The story begins in the heart of Europe, in the region we now call Austria and southern Germany. Around 1,200 years before Christ, something remarkable happened. A culture emerged that would transform the Bronze Age into the Iron Age. Archaeologists call them the Helsted culture, named after a small Austrian village where incredible treasures were discovered. These were the first Celts, and they possessed something that gave them power beyond measure: iron. While other peoples still relied on soft bronze for weapons and tools, the Celts had mastered the art of working iron, a metal harder and more deadly than anything seen before. Imagine standing in one of their workshops. The heat from the forge makes the air shimmer. A smith, his arms thick with muscle, hammers glowing metal on an anvil. Sparks fly like tiny stars. He is not just making a sword. He is creating a weapon that can cut through bronze armor like cloth, that can hold an edge through 100 battles. This technological advantage made Celtic warriors nearly invincible against their neighbors. Tribe after tribe fell before them or joined them, swelling their numbers and spreading their culture like wildfire across the continent. But the Celts were far more than brutal conquerors. They were artists of stunning skill. Their metalwork showed a sophistication that would not be matched for centuries. They created intricate jewelry with swirling patterns that seemed to move before your eyes, golden torques that wrapped around the necks of chiefs and warriors, bronze mirrors polished to perfection, and ornate shields decorated with images of animals and abstract designs that somehow captured the energy of nature itself. Every piece told a story, every pattern held meaning in their complex spiritual worldview. The Celtic expansion began slowly, then exploded across Europe like a summer storm. By 500 years before Christ, Celtic tribes had reached the Atlantic Ocean to the west, where they would settle Ireland and Britain. To the south, they crossed the Alps and poured into northern Italy, a land the Romans called Cisalpine Gaul. To the east, they pushed deep into the Balkans and even reached Anatolia, where a Celtic tribe called the Galatians would establish a kingdom that lasted for centuries. Can you imagine the shock of the settled peoples of the Mediterranean when these tall, fierce warriors appeared at their borders, speaking a strange language and demanding tribute or battle? Their society was unlike anything the classical world had seen. The Celts had no emperors, no permanent capitals, no written laws carved in stone. Instead, they organized themselves into tribes, each led by a king or queen, chosen for their courage, wisdom, or noble birth. Yes, queens. Celtic women held power that would have been unthinkable in Rome or Greece. They could own property, choose their husbands, fight in battles, and even rule entire tribes. The famous British Queen Boudica, who would later burn Roman cities to the ground, was not an exception, but an example of Celtic tradition. Within each tribe, society divided into clear classes. At the top stood the warrior nobility, men and women who had proven themselves in combat and who wore their wealth openly in golden jewelry and fine clothes dyed in brilliant colors. Below them came the skilled artisans, the smiths and craftsmen, whose work kept the tribe strong and prosperous. Then the farmers and herders who worked the land. And woven through all levels of society, standing apart yet essential, were the druids. These mysterious figures served as priests, judges, teachers, and advisors. They memorized the laws, the histories, the sacred knowledge of their people. They alone could read the will of the gods in the flight of birds, the rustling of oak leaves, the patterns of stars. The Celtic language family spread with their power. From Galatia in the east to Galicia in the west, people spoke related tongues, could understand each other's songs and sagas, shared the same gods under different names. This linguistic unity created a cultural bond stronger than any political alliance. A warrior from Gaul could travel to Britain and find himself understood, welcomed into a feast hall where the customs felt familiar, even if the faces were strange. This network of shared identity made the Celtic world vast and interconnected in ways that would puzzle the more centralized empires of the south. Their gods reflected their world. The Celts saw divinity everywhere, in rivers and mountains, in thunder and sunrise, in the cycle of seasons. They worshipped hundreds of deities, local and universal, benevolent and terrifying. Tyrannes the Thunderer, whose voice rumbled across storm clouds. Epona the Horse Goddess, protector of cavalry and travelers. Cernunnos the Horned God, lord of animals and wild places. Brigid the Fire Keeper, patroness of poetry and healing. Each tribe might emphasize different gods, but all agreed that the divine world and the mortal world touched at sacred places. Springs, groves, mountain peaks. These became shrines where offerings of gold and weapons were thrown into water or buried in earth as gifts to powers beyond human understanding. But what happened next? The Celtic world, at its height, seemed unstoppable. Their warriors had raided Greece itself, attacking the sacred oracle at Delphi. They had sacked Rome, forcing the terrified citizens to buy them off with gold. They controlled trade routes that brought amber from the Baltic, tin from Cornwall, Mediterranean wines, and olive oil north to their hill forts and settlements. Surely such a powerful culture would build its own empire to rival Persia or Egypt. It never happened. The very things that made the Celts strong also made them vulnerable. Their fierce independence meant the tribes rarely united for long. Today's allies might be tomorrow's enemies, fighting over cattle, territory, or honor. They had no standing armies in peacetime, just warriors who gathered when their chief called them to war. They had no written records to preserve knowledge or coordinate across vast distances. Everything depended on memory, on the druids who could recite genealogies going back 20 generations, but whose knowledge died with them if they were killed. And then came Rome. At first, the Romans seemed like just another people to raid or trade with. Celtic tribes had been dealing with the Greeks and other Mediterranean cultures for centuries. What made Rome different? What made them so dangerous? The answer lay in something the Celts could never have predicted. Roman discipline, Roman organization, Roman patience. Where Celtic warriors fought for glory and individual honor, Roman legions fought as a machine, each soldier a cog in a larger mechanism. Where Celtic tribes made temporary alliances, Rome built permanent conquests, roads and walls and colonies that transformed the land itself. The first serious clash came in Cisalpine Gaul, the Po Valley of northern Italy. Celtic tribes had settled there, rich, fertile land perfect for farming and raiding. Rome, still a growing power, saw this as both a threat and an opportunity. The wars that followed were brutal. Celtic warriors, magnificent in single combat, struggled against Roman formations. The pilum, the Roman javelin, could punch through Celtic shields. The gladius, the short Roman sword, was perfect for stabbing in the tight press of shield-to-shield fighting. Battle after battle, the Romans ground down Celtic resistance through sheer persistence and tactical superiority. By 200 years before Christ, Cisalpine Gaul had become a Roman province. The Celtic tribes there faced a choice: submit to Roman rule, adopt Roman ways, or flee north across the Alps. Many chose submission, gradually losing their language and culture as they became Romanized. But others remembered. They told their children stories of freedom, of days when Celtic warriors answered to no foreign power. These stories would matter, would kindle rebellion generations later. Yet even as Rome conquered the south, the Celtic heartland remained strong. Gaul, the land we now call France, Belgium, and Western Germany, still belonged to powerful tribes. The Arverni, the Aedui, the Belgi, dozens of others, each controlling their territory, their trade, their destiny. Britain and Ireland remained untouched. Misty islands at the edge of the world where druids still taught in sacred groves and kings ruled from ancient hill forts. Spain's Celtic tribes, the Celti-Iberians, mixed their culture with that of the Iberians, creating a unique hybrid civilization. The Celtic world had shrunk, but it endured. Then everything changed. In 58 years before Christ, a Roman general arrived in southern Gaul with orders to protect Roman allies from migrating Germanic tribes. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. He was ambitious, brilliant, and utterly ruthless. He saw in Gaul not just a military assignment, but an opportunity to win glory, wealth, and political power that would make him master of Rome itself. The Celtic tribes of Gaul had no idea that they stood on the edge of a catastrophe that would reshape their entire world. Caesar's first campaigns were quick and devastating. He claimed to be defending Gaul from German invaders, but his true goal was conquest. He defeated the Helvetii, a Celtic tribe trying to migrate to new lands. He crushed the German king Ariovistus and drove his army back across the Rhine. He marched into Belgium and subdued the fierce Belgi, who had boasted that they were the bravest of all Gauls. One by one, tribes that had never known foreign rule found themselves facing a choice that was no choice at all: ally with Rome or be destroyed. Some tribes chose alliance, hoping to use Rome against their rivals. The Aedui, old enemies of the Arverni, welcomed Caesar and provided him with supplies and guides. This decision would haunt them, for Caesar treated allies and enemies with equal cynicism, taking what he needed from both. Other tribes chose resistance, gathering their warriors and challenging the legions to battle. They learned, at terrible cost, that bravery alone could not defeat Roman military science. The campaigns grew more brutal each year. Caesar crossed the Rhine, the first Roman general to do so, building a bridge in just 10 days to prove Roman engineering could overcome any obstacle. He even crossed the Channel to Britain, raiding the southern coast twice, though he never attempted full conquest. These expeditions served their purpose. They terrified the Celtic world and amazed the Roman people back home, who read Caesar's carefully crafted reports and believed they were witnessing the conquest of the ends of the earth. But Celtic resistance was far from broken. In the winter camps, around fires in the long halls, warriors and druids spoke of the old days, of freedom, of gods who demanded courage, not submission. A new generation of leaders emerged, young men who had seen their fathers humbled by Rome and swore it would not happen to them. They began to whisper of something the Celts had rarely achieved: unity. What if the tribes stopped fighting each other and turned all their strength against the common enemy? What if all of Gaul rose as one? This dream found its champion in a young nobleman of the Arverni tribe. His name was Vercingetorix. He was tall, charismatic, and burning with a vision of a free Gaul united under Celtic rule. In the bitter winter of 53 to 52 years before Christ, he began to organize the greatest rebellion Gaul had ever seen. Tribe after tribe answered his call. Even some of Caesar's allies wavered, wondering if perhaps the time had come to throw off the Roman yoke. Caesar, spending the winter south of the Alps as he always did, received the news with alarm. His conquest, which had seemed nearly complete, was unraveling. Worse, if Gaul united under strong leadership, if the tribes learned to fight together with strategy and discipline, they might actually drive Rome out. Everything he had gained in 8 years of campaigning, all the glory and wealth and political capital, could vanish like morning mist. He had to act, had to move faster than his enemies expected, had to prove that Roman will could not be broken. The stage was set for the final confrontation. On one side, the might of Rome, disciplined legions and superior siege equipment, and an alliance system that could call reinforcements from across the Mediterranean. On the other, the fury of Gaul, thousands of warriors united for the first time in living memory, fighting for their homes, their freedom, their very identity as a people. The clash between these forces would produce some of the most traumatic moments in ancient history. Stories of courage and treachery, victory and defeat that still echo across the centuries. The battle for Gaul had entered its final desperate phase. Second, sacred warriors, the druids, battle tactics, and Celtic religion. To understand why the Celts fought with such fury, why they terrified even Rome's battle-hardened legions, you must first understand what they believed. The Celts did not fear death, not because they were reckless, but because death, to them, was not an ending. It was a doorway. Their druids taught that the soul was immortal, that it passed from one body to another in an endless cycle of rebirth. A warrior killed in battle would feast in the halls of the gods, then return to the world in a new form. This belief made them fearless in ways that unnerved their enemies. How do you break the spirit of men who welcome death as an adventure? The druids themselves were perhaps the most mysterious element of Celtic society. They left no written records. Everything we know comes from outsiders, mostly Roman writers who viewed them with a mixture of fascination and horror. But even these hostile sources could not deny the power druids held over their people. They were priests who performed sacred rituals in groves of ancient oak trees. They were judges who settled disputes and pronounced sentences that no king could overturn. They were teachers who trained the sons and daughters of nobility in law, poetry, medicine, and the movements of stars. They were prophets who claimed to read the future in the flight of ravens, the patterns of clouds, the entrails of sacrificed animals. A druid's training lasted 20 years. 20 years of memorizing thousands of verses, learning the names and properties of hundreds of plants, studying the calendar and the seasons, understanding the complex web of tribal genealogies and alliances. They wore white robes and carried staffs of sacred wood. They alone could enter the Nemeton, the sacred grove, where the gods walked closest to the mortal world. In these groves, rituals took place that Roman writers described with horrified whispers. Human sacrifice. Prisoners and criminals burned alive in massive wicker figures. Their screams offered to the gods as payment for victory or good harvests. Were these stories true? We cannot be certain. Roman propaganda had every reason to paint the Celts as barbarians in need of civilizing conquest. But Celtic art shows severed heads, a motif that appears again and again on shields, coins, and temple decorations. Classical writers describe Celtic warriors collecting the heads of enemies, hanging them from their horses, or displaying them at the entrances to their homes. The head, to the Celts, was the seat of the soul. To take an enemy's head was to claim their spiritual power, to prevent their rebirth. It was both trophy and religious act, honoring the fallen warrior by preserving their essence. The druids also served as living libraries. Without written language for most of their history, the Celts preserved knowledge through memory and oral tradition. Druids could recite the genealogy of every noble family going back generations, remember every law and legal precedent, recall every story of gods and heroes. This gave them enormous influence. When disputes arose between tribes, druids would gather to debate the law and pronounce judgment. Even mighty kings bowed to their decisions, for to defy a druid was to risk the anger of the gods themselves. But what of the warriors themselves? What made Celtic fighters so formidable? First, understand that every free Celtic man was a warrior. From childhood, boys trained with weapons, learning to ride horses, to throw spears, to wield the long Celtic sword that could split a man from shoulder to hip. Fighting was not just a skill, but an art, a path to glory, an honor that elevated a man above his fellows. The greatest warriors became champions, heroes whose names lived on in songs and sagas. To die forgotten was a fate worse than death. To die gloriously in battle was to achieve immortality. Celtic warfare combined individual heroism with shocking psychological tactics. Before a battle, warriors would work themselves into a frenzy. They shouted war cries, beat their swords against their shields in deafening rhythm, blew Karnak's war horns that made sounds like screaming animals. Some warriors fought naked, their bodies painted with woad, a blue dye made from plants. They believed this made them invulnerable, protected by the gods. Imagine being a Roman soldier, trained to fight in disciplined ranks, and seeing hundreds of naked blue-skinned giants charging toward you, screaming like demons. Many enemies broke and ran before the Celts even reached their lines. The Celts also practiced single combat before battles. Champions from each side would step forward and fight one-on-one while both armies watched. These duels were not just about killing an enemy. They were about honor, about proving courage, about winning glory that would echo through time. A warrior who defeated a famous champion gained prestige that could elevate his entire tribe. Roman generals, practical and disciplined, found this custom baffling and sometimes used it against the Celts, sending skilled gladiators to kill Celtic champions and demoralize their armies. But Celtic tactics were not all about individual glory. They were masters of guerrilla warfare, ambush, and raids. In their home terrain, forests and hills they knew intimately, Celtic warriors could appear from nowhere, strike hard, and vanish before the enemy could react. They used chariots in Britain and Gaul, two-wheeled vehicles pulled by swift horses. A driver controlled the chariot while a warrior stood behind, throwing javelins or leaping off to fight on foot. The noise, the speed, the sudden shock of chariots bursting from the tree line could shatter enemy formations before the real fighting even began. Their swords deserve special mention. The Celtic long sword, called a spatha, was a masterpiece of ironworking. Longer than the Roman gladius, it was designed for slashing attacks from horseback or in open combat. Celtic smiths knew secrets of metallurgy that produced blades both flexible and sharp, weapons that could bend without breaking and return to true. Some warriors carried swords passed down through generations, named weapons with their own histories and reputations. To carry your grandfather's sword into battle was to carry his courage and skill with you. Shields were works of art as much as tools of war, made from wood covered with leather or bronze. They were painted in bright colors and decorated with swirling patterns, animal figures, or faces meant to frighten enemies. The boss in the center, a metal dome protecting the hand grip, could itself be used as a weapon, punched into an opponent's face with crushing force. Some shields were so beautifully crafted that they were clearly ceremonial, too precious for actual combat, made to display wealth and status. Celtic religion intertwined with every aspect of warfare. Before a battle, druids would sacrifice animals and read the omens in their organs. A favorable sign could inspire warriors to reckless bravery. An unfavorable sign might cause an army to refuse combat entirely, no matter what their king commanded. The druid's word carried that much weight. They also performed rituals to curse enemies, to call down the wrath of gods upon opposing armies. Whether these curses worked or not mattered less than the psychological effect. Celtic warriors believed they had divine favor, while enemies feared they faced supernatural powers. The Celtic calendar organized around sacred festivals that marked the turning of seasons. Samhain, when the boundary between the living world and the spirit world grew thin. Imbolc, celebrating the first stirrings of spring. Beltane, the fire festival of summer. Lugnasad, the harvest celebration. These festivals were times of feasting, trading, political gathering, and religious ceremony. Tribes that might be enemies during the year would observe truces during major festivals, coming together to honor the gods and renew the bonds of Celtic identity. Water held special significance in Celtic spirituality. Rivers, lakes, and springs were considered gateways to the otherworld, places where humans could communicate with gods and spirits. The Celts threw valuable objects into sacred waters as offerings. Swords, shields, torques of twisted gold, bronze cauldrons. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of these artifacts from ancient waterways across Europe. Each one represents a prayer, a thank offering, a desperate plea for divine intervention. Imagine a warrior, victorious in battle, standing at the edge of a sacred pool. He holds the sword that saved his life, the weapon that killed 6 enemies, and he throws it into the depths, a gift to the gods who granted him victory. Celtic women held a place in society that shocked Mediterranean observers. They could be warriors, leading war bands into battle. They could be druids, though perhaps less commonly than men. They could own and inherit property, divorce unfaithful husbands, and speak in tribal councils. Greek and Roman writers described Celtic women as tall, fierce, and as dangerous as the men. One famous story tells of a Roman diplomat who tried to negotiate with a Celtic king, only to have the king's wife interrupt and correct him repeatedly. The embarrassed Roman asked why a woman was speaking in such an important discussion. The king replied, "We Celts have the wisdom to let our women speak. Do you Romans not trust yours?" The most famous Celtic woman warrior was Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe in Britain. When her husband died and Roman administrators tried to seize her kingdom, she raised the largest rebellion Britain had ever seen. She burned Londinium, modern London, to the ground. She destroyed 2 Roman legions. For a brief, glorious moment, it seemed she might actually drive Rome out of Britain. Her revolt ultimately failed, crushed by superior Roman numbers and tactics. But Boudica herself became immortal, a symbol of Celtic resistance that inspired rebels and poets for 2,000 years. Now, back to Gaul and the gathering storm. Vercingetorix had achieved what seemed impossible. He had united dozens of tribes under his leadership, creating an army that numbered in the tens of thousands. But he knew that simply facing Caesar in open battle would be suicide. The Romans were too disciplined, too experienced. So Vercingetorix adopted a strategy that would have made his ancestors proud: guerrilla warfare. He ordered his warriors to burn their own villages, their own crops, anything that might feed Caesar's legions. Let the Romans march through a wasteland. Let them starve while Celtic warriors struck from the forests, harassed their supply lines, wore them down. The strategy worked for a time. Caesar's legions, hungry and demoralized, struggled through hostile territory. They found no food, no shelter, only smoking ruins and empty fields. Celtic attacks came without warning. A foraging party would be ambushed and slaughtered. A supply column would be cut off and destroyed. The Romans, masters of set-piece battles, floundered against an enemy who refused to fight on their terms. Caesar's officers began to whisper that perhaps Gaul could not be conquered after all, that the campaign had become unwinnable. But Vercingetorix made a critical mistake. One of his subordinate chiefs, a man named Vercingetorix, convinced him to defend the town of Avaricum against Caesar's siege. The town was wealthy, full of supplies the Celtic army desperately needed. Vercingetorix reluctantly agreed, though he knew it violated his scorched earth strategy. It was exactly what Caesar had been waiting for: a target he could attack, a battle he could win. The Romans surrounded Avaricum and began building siege works, enormous ramps and towers that rose higher than the town walls. The siege was brutal. Celtic warriors fought desperately to stop the Roman advance. They used fire arrows, tried to undermine the siege ramps, made suicidal sorties that killed hundreds, but barely slowed the methodical Roman progress. Then came the rain, days of it, turning the siege works into rivers of mud. The Romans struggled to keep their footing. The siege ramps began to collapse. For a moment, it seemed the gods favored the Celts. But Caesar drove his men with threats and promises, rebuilt what the rain destroyed. And finally, after 27 days, his soldiers stormed over the walls. What followed was a massacre. The Roman soldiers, exhausted and bitter from the long siege, showed no mercy. They killed everyone they could find: men, women, children. The classical sources say that out of 40,000 people in Avaricum, barely 800 escaped. The town burned. Its wealth, the food and supplies Vercingetorix had wanted to preserve, went up in flames or into Roman hands. The defeat shook the Celtic Confederation. Some tribes began to waver, wondering if they had backed the wrong leader. But Vercingetorix was not finished. He gathered his surviving forces and retreated to the fortress of Gergovia, built on a steep hill that seemed nearly impregnable. When Caesar followed and attempted to storm the position, Celtic warriors drove the Romans back with heavy losses. For the first time in his Gallic campaigns, Caesar had been decisively beaten in open combat. The victory electrified the Celtic world. Tribes that had been neutral now joined the rebellion. Even some of Caesar's allies defected, believing the tide had turned. Vercingetorix stood at the height of his power, commander of the largest Celtic army ever assembled, defender of Gaul's freedom. The final confrontation was coming. Caesar and Vercingetorix, Roman discipline against Celtic fury, the future of Gaul hanging in the balance. Everything the Celts believed, everything they valued, their freedom, their gods, their way of life, would be tested in the battles ahead. The druids performed their rituals. The warriors sharpened their swords and painted their shields. And Vercingetorix prepared to lead his people in a struggle that would echo through history as one of the greatest clashes between the classical and the Celtic worlds. Third, Rome's nightmare, epic battles and the fall of Celtic independence. After his victory at Gergovia, Vercingetorix faced a choice that would determine the fate of all Gaul. Should he continue his hit-and-run tactics, leading Caesar's armies slowly through ambushes and raids? Or should he risk everything in one massive confrontation that might drive Rome from Gaul forever? The Celtic chiefs argued passionately on both sides. Some urged caution, remembering how scorched earth tactics had nearly broken the Romans. Others demanded action, a glorious battle that would prove Celtic courage and win freedom through strength of arms. Vercingetorix chose boldness. He gathered his cavalry, the finest horsemen in all of Gaul, and attacked Caesar's army as it marched through open country. The Celtic cavalry numbered 15,000 riders, a thundering mass of men and horses that should have overwhelmed any opposition. They charged with characteristic fury, war cries echoing across the plain, spears leveled, swords flashing in the sun. But Caesar had learned from years of fighting Celts. He had recruited Germanic cavalry as mercenaries, warriors whose horsemanship equaled the Gauls and whose discipline exceeded it. A cavalry battle raged for hours. Dust rose in choking clouds. Men and horses fell in tangled heaps. The thunder of hooves, the clash of weapons, the screams of wounded animals and dying warriors created chaos that neither side could fully control. Then, at the critical moment, Caesar unleashed his Germanic horsemen in a flanking attack. The Celtic cavalry, pressed from two sides, began to waver. What started as an organized withdrawal became a rout. Thousands of Celtic horsemen fled the field, abandoning their infantry, abandoning their commander, abandoning the dream of united Gaul. Vercingetorix, watching his cavalry dissolve, made a desperate decision. He ordered his remaining forces, some 80,000 warriors, to retreat to the hill fort of Alesia. The fortress sat atop a steep plateau, surrounded by rivers and valleys that made direct assault nearly impossible. It was one of the strongest positions in Gaul, stocked with food and weapons. Vercingetorix believed he could hold out indefinitely while reinforcements gathered from across Gaul. He sent messengers riding hard to every tribe, calling them to bring their warriors and rescue the army trapped at Alesia. The fate of Celtic freedom now depended on whether help would arrive in time. Caesar saw the trap Vercingetorix had walked into, and he moved with ruthless efficiency. If the Celts wanted to make Alesia their stronghold, he would turn it into their tomb. He ordered his legions to build fortifications around the entire hill, a ring of ditches, walls, and towers designed to prevent anyone from escaping. But Caesar went further. He built a second ring of fortifications facing outward, preparing for the relief army he knew would come. The engineering challenge was staggering. His soldiers dug ditches 10 feet deep and 15 feet wide. They built wooden walls topped with sharpened stakes. They planted fields of hidden pits filled with pointed stakes, covered with brush to look like solid ground. They created killing zones where Celtic attacks would break against Roman defenses like waves against rocks. The work took weeks. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watched the walls rising and understood what Caesar was doing. His fortress had become his prison. Food began to run low. He ordered all non-combatants expelled from the city, women and children and elderly people, hoping Caesar would let them through his lines. It was a terrible choice, sacrificing the weak to preserve the strong. But Caesar refused to let them pass. He would not waste food on feeding Celtic refugees. The expelled people gathered in the no-man's land between the two armies, crying for mercy that never came, slowly starving within sight of both forces. Then the relief army arrived. 250,000 warriors, gathered from tribes across Gaul, the largest Celtic army ever assembled. They covered the hills around Alesia like a second forest, their campfires at night looking like fallen stars. Inside the fortress, Vercingetorix and his trapped warriors heard the war cries of their brothers and knew that salvation had come. Now Caesar faced the nightmare scenario he had planned for. Enemies on both sides, outnumbered perhaps 10 to 1, with no possibility of retreat or reinforcement. If his defenses failed, every Roman would die. The Celtic relief army attacked with everything they had. Wave after wave of warriors charged the outer fortifications, trying to break through to their trapped comrades. At the same time, Vercingetorix led his forces in desperate sorties against the inner walls. Caesar's legions fought on two fronts simultaneously, racing from crisis to crisis, shoring up defenses here, counterattacking there, driven by the knowledge that one breakthrough would doom them all. The battle raged for 3 days, the longest and bloodiest engagement of the entire Gallic War. Can you imagine the chaos? The noise alone must have been deafening. Hundreds of thousands of men fighting, dying, screaming. A clash of iron, on wood, on bone. War horns blowing. Officers shouting orders. Wounded men crying for help or for death. The Romans fought with discipline born of years of training, each man trusting the soldier beside him, following orders even as exhaustion blurred their vision. The Celts fought with desperate courage, knowing their entire world depended on victory. That defeat meant slavery, or death and the end of freedom in Gaul. At the critical moment, when it seemed the Roman lines might break, Caesar himself entered the battle. He put on a distinctive red cloak so his soldiers could see him, and rode to the most threatened section of defenses. His presence steadied his men. They fought harder, knowing their general stood with them, shared their danger. Celtic warriors saw the red cloak and redoubled their efforts to kill the Roman commander. But Caesar's bodyguard, veterans who had followed him through a decade of wars, formed a wall of shields and iron that no attack could penetrate. The turning point came when Caesar led a cavalry charge against the rear of the Celtic relief army. He had held back his horsemen for exactly this moment, conserving their strength while his infantry absorbed the main assaults. Now he unleashed them in a perfectly timed strike that caught the Celts by surprise. The cavalry smashed into warriors already exhausted from days of fighting, cut through their ranks like a sword through cloth, created panic that spread like wildfire. What had been an organized assault became a mob of fleeing men, each thinking only of escape. Inside Elysia, Vercingetorix watched the relief army dissolve and knew the end had come. He had one last card to play. He could order his warriors to fight to the death, to make the Romans pay for every foot of ground in blood and time. It would be glorious. It would be useless. Tens of thousands would die for nothing. The war was lost. Rome had won. Continuing to fight would only add to the count of dead without changing the outcome. So Vercingetorix made the hardest choice a Celtic leader could make. He chose to surrender. The next day, dressed in his finest armor, mounted on his best warhorse, Vercingetorix rode alone from Elysia to Caesar's camp. Classical sources describe the scene with dramatic detail. The Celtic leader circled Caesar 3 times in silence, then dismounted, removed his armor piece by piece, and laid his weapons at the Roman general's feet. He offered himself as a prisoner, hoping his surrender might win mercy for his followers. Caesar accepted the weapons, accepted the surrender, and ordered Vercingetorix thrown in chains. The greatest Celtic leader of the age would spend the next 6 years in a Roman prison, then be paraded through Rome in Caesar's triumph before being strangled in a dark cell. His sacrifice bought nothing. Caesar enslaved or killed much of the Celtic army anyway. The fall of Elysia broke the back of Celtic resistance in Gaul. Some tribes continued to fight in scattered rebellions, but never again with the unity and strength that Vercingetorix had achieved. Caesar spent 2 more years pacifying the province, burning villages that resisted, selling entire populations into slavery, installing Roman-friendly chiefs to rule the surviving tribes. Gaul, which had been Celtic for 1,000 years, began its transformation into a Roman province. The process would take generations, but it was inexorable. Latin replaced Celtic languages. Roman laws replaced Druidic justice. Roman gods merged with Celtic deities until the old religion became unrecognizable. But the Celtic world was not entirely crushed. Britain remained free, protected by the sea that had turned back Caesar's limited invasions. Ireland, even further from Roman reach, never felt a Roman sword. In these islands, Celtic culture survived in its purest form. The druids continued to teach in sacred groves. The old gods received their sacrifices. The old stories were told and retold, preserved in an unbroken chain of memory that would last another 1,000 years. Then, nearly a century after Caesar's conquest of Gaul, Rome tried to finish what he had started. Emperor Claudius, needing military glory to secure his shaky throne, ordered the invasion of Britain in the year 43 after Christ. 4 legions crossed the Channel with auxiliary troops and cavalry, a professional army numbering perhaps 40,000 men. They landed in the south and began the methodical conquest that had worked so well in Gaul. British tribes, divided and suspicious of each other, fell one by one to Roman tactics. But Britain was not Gaul. The land was wilder, the tribes more fierce, the druids more powerful. In the mountains of Wales, Celtic warriors fought guerrilla campaigns that cost Rome dearly. In the north, tribes called the Picts and the Caledonians proved so difficult to conquer that Rome eventually built walls to keep them out rather than waste resources trying to defeat them. And in the year 60, a British queen reminded Rome that Celtic fury was not dead. Boudicca, whose husband had been a client king allied with Rome, watched Roman administrators humiliate her family after her husband's death. They flogged her publicly, raped her daughters, seized her property as if she were a slave rather than a queen. It was a fatal mistake. Boudica raised the standard of rebellion, and tens of thousands of British warriors answered her call. The rage that had been building for 17 years of Roman occupation finally exploded. The rebels struck with terrifying speed and violence. They destroyed the Roman colony at Camulodunum, modern Colchester, killing every Roman citizen they could find. When the Roman Ninth Legion marched to help, Celtic warriors ambushed and annihilated it, 2,000 soldiers dead in a single afternoon. Boudica's army, swollen to perhaps 100,000 warriors, swept south toward Londinium. The Romans abandoned the city without a fight. British warriors burned it to the ground so completely that archaeologists still find a layer of red ash marking that destruction, a scar in the earth that has lasted 2,000 years. For months, it seemed Boudica might actually win. She had destroyed 3 Roman cities, killed perhaps 70,000 Romans and their allies, thrown the province into chaos. But history repeated itself. The Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, gathered his remaining legions and forced Boudica to fight a pitched battle. The Romans chose the ground carefully, a narrow valley where Celtic numbers became a disadvantage. The legions formed their disciplined ranks and waited. The Celtic army attacked as their ancestors had always attacked, with wild charges and individual heroism. They crashed against Roman shields like a storm against a mountain. And like at Alesia, like at every major battle between Rome and the Celts, discipline defeated courage. The Romans held their formation, used their short swords in the close press, cut down wave after wave of attackers. When the Celts finally broke and ran, the slaughter was immense. Tens of thousands died. Boudica herself took poison rather than be captured. Her rebellion, like Vercingetorix's, had failed. Yet something remarkable happened over the following centuries. Rome conquered, but the Celts endured. In Gaul, which became so thoroughly Romanized that it took a new name, France, Celtic influence survived in the land itself. The boundaries of medieval French provinces followed old Celtic tribal territories. Celtic words blended into the Latin that would become French. Celtic artistic styles influenced Roman art, creating something new from the fusion. In Britain, Rome never fully controlled the island. Wales remained stubbornly Celtic. Scotland stayed free behind Hadrian's Wall. And when the Roman Empire finally collapsed 5 centuries after Caesar crossed the Rhine, Celtic culture surged back. In Ireland, which Rome never touched at all, Celtic Christianity emerged, a unique blend of old Druidic learning and new Christian faith. Irish monks would preserve classical knowledge through the Dark Ages, copying manuscripts and keeping literacy alive when much of Europe descended into chaos. The Celtic languages survived: Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Welsh, Breton, Cornish. Some thrived, others barely survived, but none completely died. In the 21st century, millions still speak Celtic tongues, and millions more claim Celtic ancestry. The art survived, those swirling patterns and intricate designs that make Celtic jewelry and manuscripts instantly recognizable. The music survived, haunting melodies played on harps and pipes that echo songs sung 2,000 years ago. And the stories survived. Tales of King Arthur, which may preserve memories of a Celtic war leader who fought the Saxon invasions. Stories of Cuchulainn, the Irish hero whose rage in battle made him unrecognizable as human. Legends of the Morrigan, the war goddess who appeared as a raven on battlefields. Myths of the otherworld, of fairy folk and enchanted islands, of heroes who ventured beyond the mortal realm and returned changed. These stories, preserved by druids and later by Christian monks, became part of the cultural foundation of medieval Europe. What if things had gone differently? What if Vercingetorix had won at Alesia? What if Boudicca had driven Rome from Britain? We can only imagine. Perhaps Celtic civilization would have developed its own empire, its own written culture, its own path separate from Rome. Perhaps European history would look completely different, built on Celtic rather than Latin foundations. Or perhaps the lack of centralization that made the Celts vulnerable to Rome would have left them vulnerable to other invaders, Germanic tribes or Huns, or some other migrating people. What we know is this: the Celts were not the barbarians Roman propaganda painted them as. They were a sophisticated culture with advanced metalworking, beautiful art, complex religion, and social structures that in some ways surpassed their conquerors. They valued individual freedom more than collective power, personal honor more than strategic advantage, spiritual truth more than material conquest. These values made them magnificent and made them vulnerable. They fought Rome for centuries and ultimately lost, but they never completely surrendered. They bent, adapted, survived in the margins and the mountains and the mist-shrouded islands at the edge of the Roman world. And when Rome fell, Celtic culture emerged from those refuges and helped shape the new Europe, rising from the empire's ruins. The Celts did not conquer the world, but their spirit, their art, their stories became part of the inheritance of the Western world. That is its own kind of victory, one that echoes across 2,000 years and shows no sign of fading. And so today we discovered that the Celts were far more than warriors who fought Rome. They were artists, druids, storytellers, and free people who chose honor over submission. Their kingdoms fell, but their spirit never died. Personally, I believe that Celtic courage in the face of impossible odds teaches us something timeless about the value of freedom and identity. What do you think? Which Celtic leader inspired you most, Vercingetorix or Boudicca? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this epic journey through history, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Pages from History. Turn on notifications for more incredible stories from the ancient world. Thank you for watching. See you in the next chapter of history.